Hello, my name is Robert Teester, and this talk is a part of a series of talks that I'm giving called the Cultivation of Wisdom. And this particular talk is on the psychology of depression. Sometimes when you talk about depression, people think that it's the same as sadness, but there's a real difference between sadness and depression. Sadness is a feeling state, and there's a lot of feelings behind exploring sadness, but depression is a form of numbing out, and it's a numbness that encapsulates three different levels of the emotions and the psychology and also the level of spirituality. If you were to ask a depressed person what they feel, they would probably say they don't feel anything, or they feel numb, or they're just confused about it. When we're depressed, we are shut down, and we do not know how we feel, and we can't explore that because it's a dead-end street. But life is going on, and a depressed person really needs to get some help at this point to help them come out of the cave and reassure them that it's okay to feel whatever feeling that is there. It's in their own mind. It's not in the world per se. And so sometimes they need a supportive environment, and sometimes they need a professional to help them come back out and get on with their life. What's very important to understand is that if we do become depressed, we shut down all of the possibilities that exist at that level. It means that we can't go forward anymore. It's as if we went into a cave and closed the door behind us. Now, this will necessarily create, on some level, a feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. Now, the trade-off for a person that's getting depressed, they feel safe because they don't feel anything. They go numb. But of course, there is a high cost to that. It means that they're no longer able to go forward. It means that they are going either sideways now because they can't go forward, or in the worst case scenario, they go backward or down into a hole, and they feel the helplessness and hopelessness of that, but they're not in touch with that either. They just feel stuck. But of course, the depression is only in their mind. It's like the ostrich that sticks his head in the hole, and then a lion walks up and they see the ostrich, but the ostrich thinks he's hiding. That's what depression is like too. The rest of the flow of life is going on endlessly around everyone. But a depressed person shuts down and doesn't know that anymore, and they think that they're safe in their little hole. When we are born into a human body, we're here for a reason, and we are here to develop ourselves spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, so that we can go on ascendantly into our next life form. But while we're here, we have a lot of issues to work out. That's why we're here. So we have to look inwardly and start working with the material, with this emotional, psychological, and spiritual material that are important for us to work on in this lifetime. And if we create a depression, it means that we are too frightened to go forward, and we're insulating ourselves from this existential spiritual task that we have been invited into by taking the human form. And so it's very important on the energetic level that we free up the depressed places, or these obstacles and psychological and emotional fears and anxieties and anguish that we carry in our body, so that we continue to ascend. All of the religions of the world deal with this on some level. Why are we here? This question keeps getting posed to us. In the Christian form, they might say that we're pulled towards God, which is fine, that's true. If you look to the religions of India, like Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, they will say that we are being pulled towards completion and enlightenment to become fully awake in this life. Every spiritual tradition has its own language that it uses, but the point is to continually open up our heart fully and deeply in this life. And there's many obstacles that are created, and I will get into this material shortly, but we all have issues to work with. It isn't like there are perfect people walking around and they're fully developed. If they came into a human body, they've got issues to work through, and it's existentially and spiritually necessary to find those issues and work with them so that we continue to ascend. So there's a couple of different ways that people don't take that path of ascendant. It feels so overwhelming. Now, there might be emotional material that's in our way. There might be psychological issues too. There's also a spiritual fear that the project is too big for us, and we sometimes feel too little to continue on our path. Some people get depressed in the face of such a major project, and some people feel terribly anxious. And so either way, it can be disabling for us to continue. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. So we are invited by the philosophers of the time to look inwardly, and that this is important and it counts, and it can open your heart back up. The point of all these religions and spiritual paths and philosophies and psychology too is to continually open up. So if you're shutting down, such as a depression, you are not able to move forward, and you need to get some help to get out of these places that we've created in our own mind. It's not in the world itself, it's in our own mind, and we need to unfold out of that place. So it's important to understand what's happening to you, and then to do the work that you need to do to get out of that spot. Is the parenting good enough? Now, this is in professional psychology, this debate is endless, but it's a good debate, and it's one worth thinking about. What makes a set of parents who are obviously wounded, but offer parenting that's good enough for the child to do what? Well, to go out into the world and succeed. That's the point of parenting, is to get the child up to, like a bird, up to the edge of the nest and fly away, and then go on their own as an adult successfully. Now, that's a mouthful, because that's a difficult problem. That's a difficult task. It takes 18 years to raise a child, and not all children are raised equally, and not all parents are the same, and not all environments are the same. There's a lot of complexities to that question. But is it good enough? Now, most therapists probably think that everybody needs a little bit of therapy, and I'm probably one of those that believe that, because there's so many levels we're being held back by, and if we were to talk about it with a therapist, we would open back up, and then we would be more successful and happier. Depression is not a happiness. If you go into your depression, let's say you're in a therapeutic relationship, and your therapist starts inviting your feelings underneath the depression, what's under the depression, if you can get to it, get through the numbness, because people that are depressed really don't know what they feel. But if in a therapeutic environment you feel safe enough to explore that, then you will probably hit sadness. Underneath the depression is sadness. Now, why is the sadness there? Because you weren't well received. You got born into the world, and nobody was really there to welcome you, in a sense. Like, there was no welcome mat. It was difficult for you to even survive because of the chaos in the family. That creates a depressed person, because it creates depression, and underneath the depression is a sadness, and underneath the sadness is confusion, like, why am I here? Who had me? If you didn't want me, why did you create a child? And of course that creates a real existential kind of problem for parents to answer. Well, you know, we were in a short-term relationship, we had sex, and you came. I mean, that's oftentimes the answer to that. But of course, parents doctor that up. They don't want to tell you that. So if that's the case, you're going to have issues around depression because you're not feeling wanted and you're not feeling like heard and you don't feel seen. You know, as a sensitive little baby that, you know, responds well to when mom comes up and smiles and talks to him, that's an invitation. Oh, hi, mom. And I'm going to feel wanted then. But what if you don't get too much of that? And what's good enough to come out? And, you know, there's going to be places where you feel safe, and then there's places that you're going to feel like you were born in the wrong place. And you contract, and you shut down, you go numb, and you get depressed. And so that's usually how that forms in the mind. In the heart records this stuff. It isn't an intellectual exercise, and therapy oftentimes isn't. If you want to try to make it back into early childhood, you have to follow your intuition and your feelings, not your intellect. It doesn't work like that. If you want to go into early childhood, you have to have an intuitive sense that there's a sadness underneath the depression, and you follow that until you connect with it. And then you follow the sadness and go as deep as it goes. So that could be, and you start out, wherever you start, it doesn't matter. At 10 years old, you remember something. You know, 8 years old, you remember something too, you know, at 7 and 6 and so forth. You can certainly see problems when a child hits teenage years because they're getting ready to, trying to emancipate, and they're angry as hornets. The reason is because the parents weren't there for them too much, you know, and they're scared to go out into the world because they feel too wounded. But that's easy to work with that material because they're angry as hell. And that's a good thing because underneath the anger is hurt. And that's where you want to, if you're in a therapeutic environment, that's where you want to work because that's real blood flowing there. And that's good in a protected environment. It's not so good if you're in your peer group and you're getting shamed and humiliated and have to fight other people and so forth. That's not good. It has to be done in a tightly bounded professional relationship to work on this early childhood material. It's not fair to ask your friends or your spouse to do that kind of work. It's too difficult, and it takes a trained professional to do it, to help you with that. Because a professional won't shame you. They're actually very interested in when you feel the worst. That, in a way, is the best in therapy because therapeutic relationship, because you can work with that material that's bubbling up. And they will hold a safe container for you to go into that wounded child place. Talk a little bit about Carl Jung's approach to psychology. He makes the assumption, and correctly so, that each of us carry a mother wound and a father wound. So each of us has a mother. And then your mother had a mother and father on her side. Your father has a father wound, and he has a mother and father on his side. So all of a sudden, we're talking about 4 people that are affecting your life. So each of them, 4, had 8 people telling them. So all this influence, you know, whether you were born in Europe or Asia or wherever, these cultural things go on, and also what kind of parents that each of them have. And each of those, you know, mother came from a mother and father. Now that wasn't the same as your father's parents, right? So it gets complicated. But all of them influence them, and that influences how they're going to parent you. And if you're don't feel too well received by either of them, then your parents weren't well received either. It's generational like that. So who in a family system, this is the question that gets posed to you existentially, who in this family system is going to raise their hand and say, I'm going to get into therapy and work with all this collective wounding, all this collective unconscious material that my mother and father have, and then their parents had. Who in the family is finally going to stand up and go, okay, I'm going to work that through. I'm going to do inner work. So those are the people, when they feel like they're worth it, it takes a certain amount of ego strength to say, well, I'm worth that. I'm going to go into that kind of work, and I feel like it's important for me, and I'm worth fighting for. That's the kind of feeling that some people have. And they find a therapist and they start doing inner work. But let's say, for example, just to give you a broader perspective a moment, let's say your grandfather was an alcoholic, and but your mother wasn't. Your mother didn't drink. But what she did was she got involved with, some form of religion like Christianity. Then you have a father wound on your masculine side, and then you have a mother who's stronger spiritually. Well, if you do any work on that, let's say you can go one of two ways. You can follow your father's steps, your grandfather's steps, and go into the addictive patterns of substance abuse of some sort, or any addictive pattern. Doesn't matter what it is. Workaholism, too much sex or TV or whatever. But you could also go on your mother's strengths of exploring spirituality. It doesn't necessarily need to be Christian in this sense, but that you have a strong spiritual part of your life. And then you have kids, and then your wife, let's say, or husband, your mate, whoever you choose, doesn't have that going on in their system, but they had pretty healthy parents. Then your generation, your children from that marriage, as long as there were not addictive patterns being explored too heavily, then your children will be fairly healthy. It's third generation out, you see. So it's generational. So it's also the same. Let's say we mentioned that the grandfather was an alcoholic, but also the mother had a strong spiritual bent. If you decide you want to get in therapy, say, and you complete this work through all this collective unconscious material from your family, generational aspect of family systems, and you go doing inner work until you hang in there with 3 to 4 years of that, which is typically how it takes to clear that space junk out of there, then you will be pretty healthy, and you will choose a healthy mate, and you have children that are well received and healthy, good enough to where they want to explore their environment. They want to be creative. They want to give back. They're pretty magnanimous in some ways, where they're intellectually functioning at higher levels. That pays off, you see. So when you look at whole family systems, you see generationally that there are the right ways of parenting and that create better offspring, creative offspring. And so I want you to think of that in terms of doing your own work, because if you don't do your own work, you will wound your children the same way you were wounded. Now listen to that again. If you don't do your inner work, and very few people do actually their inner work. Some people go into therapy for a year, 18 months, and then they start getting too scared and then they back out. But let's say you go for 3.5, 4 years and you really wrap some of this stuff up. Then now your children will be the beneficiaries. But if you don't do it, then you will unconsciously wound your children the same way you were wounded. It might be a little less, but it might be worse, because if you start getting addictive, you start drinking and so forth, and then you will become more unconscious and you will wound your child more even. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the 3 generations are all things being equal. It means that if the second generation drinks like the grandfather did, and even more, because in these times there's more powerful drugs than ever before. And I'm speaking of these synthetics. In the old days they had heroin and opium, but now we have drugs that are synthetics and much more powerful and more prevalent and very cheap. So things can go downhill real fast, and so you will become more unconscious. And then if you have children, then you're going to wound them like you were wounded, and that unconscious material that you're self-medicating away, you think, is still there, and you're going to parent your children out of those unconscious places, and you will end up wounding them. And so the clock starts over. And it's important for you to understand that you're going to be the one hurting your own children. Now, people will oftentimes, they'll try to, let's say, get in therapy or stop the drugs or the drinking on their own. But if they do understand, what I'm saying right now, which is that, let's say you're in therapy and the therapist says to you, you're the one that's hurting your son or your daughter. They always, when parents finally get that, they start weeping. Now, that's when they really want to clean their life up. That's when they want to stop the drinking. And see, for them, it was okay because they were just hurting themselves. But when they realize they're hurting these poor, helpless little people, they get a new lease on life and say, okay, I don't want to do that to them. I mean, it was done to me. I don't want to do the same to them as was done to me. And that's a critical part of being in therapy. When that happens, I'm very happy that they get that, because then now they don't just have to listen to me tell them. They get it because their children are telling them, and I show them the symptoms of what the child's doing, and why they're doing it. And it pins back to, some of the unconscious material, and that they are hurting their child like they were hurt. And that nails them, and they're motivated, which is wonderful. And then some of the suffering can stop from then on. So you got wounded, and you were at the mercy of unconscious people. That's the way it is mostly. But this time, you're going in to save your own self, and you are at your mercy now. And so when you encounter that wounded little boy or girl in there, you just hold them in a loving way. You are there with that part of you, and that contracted energy that's in there, that wounded place, you will stay there in consciousness now, feeling a hurt little boy. You might be weeping, you might be crying, you might want to feel like running, you might be really scared, but you stay with it until it starts unfolding. Now that changes your life when you do that, because that level has been shut down since you were, say in this case, 5 years old. It could be 4. You work backwards, and so if you work through all the 5-year-old material, then you go into 4-year-old material. It unfolds like that, backwards. And then 3 and 2 and so forth. Now that's you being there for you. Your therapist is certainly holding a container and helping you do that. But that's what changes, is not the therapist. It's you being willing to go in there with that hurt little boy and hurt little girl and weeping that part out until the energy opens back up. And then you're different after that. You don't go back to that. As a depressed person, or as an angry person, or as a shut down person, the wound is healed there. That's where the switches are. The switches are in early childhood. And so that's the origin, the genesis of the wound is in that age bracket. That's why it's vital to understand that these woundings come out of 0 to 5. And after that period, you just keep acting that wound out. And in relationships, you get hurt and terribly depressed, or, all this stuff that goes on in the mating ritual, which is a battle zone, because your mate wants you there for them, and they want you there for them, and it's a power struggle. It's not a safe place to work on early childhood material, but certainly that material gets acted out in the mating ritual. And it certainly horrendously gets acted out when you have children, because your material is getting activated by your children. They don't know they're doing it, but they're now your therapist because you're feeling all kinds of feelings when they start emancipating, when they start walking and running, and when they want to explore their environment, and you're getting freaked out because you got to keep up with them, and they can get damaged easily. When a child hits 2 years old, they get their wheels, and they can get into big trouble right away. So it's almost impossible to raise a child and not get hurt somehow. They're falling over all the time. So you've got to stay on your toes, and you're getting activated too. And your parenting oftentimes comes out of the way you were parented. And then there's good parts of that, there's bad parts of that, and there's ugly parts of that. The unconscious material is the ugly part. So you want to be conscious, be aware that this is where that stuff is coming from. This is where the switches are, is down in the early childhood. So when you go down in there and you be there for that hurt little boy or hurt little girl, that's what changes your life, because you are saving your own life there. It's like midwifing in a way. You're giving birth to the part of you that was shut down, and you're opening that part back up, and that part stays open after that. It's not like it's going to shut down again after that. When you go in there fully and you complete the 5-year-old level, then you go, 5-year-old level is open for you. That's not going to change again. That's not going to go back to your depression, say, in this case. And then so if you're brave enough, you can go back, you can keep working internally, which I encourage you to do. If you're on a roll and you're finally figuring out how to break into early childhood, like 5 years old, I strongly encourage you to stay and go into 4, because there's more magic there than 5, and so forth. And 3 years old, even more so. The switches get bigger, and your life, every time you work on that material, your life will dramatically change for the better. You will start expanding. You'll become more creative. It's like flying an airplane with a bunch of dials, where you get more instruments and you can fly better. Well, that's a good metaphor, because when you open up your heart on all these levels, on all these multidimensional levels that were shut down or partly shut down or contracted a little bit or contracted a whole lot, all this myriad of feeling states that aren't completed, that are hurt, that are contracted energy, and you expand them again, then you're open. It's like opening up a lotus flower, and all these petals are open. They stay open, and then of course, if you got into a relationship and somebody hurt you, of course it's going to start contracting, but this early stuff is done. That personal biographical material gets finished. You will be open, and you will be very creative, and you'll have very clear insights into life, and you can fly your plane much better. You'll unfold your life in a much more complex and very interesting, creative way when you work on early childhood. It's connected to that. So that's why it's important. This talk is very important for you to understand that early childhood work is vital if you want to be vibrant on many levels. Do this kind of work. And depression is just a symptom, as is anxiety. It's the same thing. Anxiety is you're hopping out of your body, like that. And depression is shutting down, dying. They're reacting to the same kind of material, but one is anxiety and the other is going numb. And you have the ability to change that. Modern psychology works with this material very successfully. It's nothing new to a senior therapist. If you're working on early childhood material, as I mentioned before, find a therapist that does early childhood work. If they don't specifically say that, you can't assume necessarily that they know how to do that, and you can't assume that they've done it themselves. Only senior therapists, and I've known a lot of therapists, so You want to find one that's done their own work, and you can interview them. And if you do interview them, interview 3 or 4 of them so that you get a sense of who's holding the ground like that. You'll get a feeling from it. Yeah, they already know it and they're safe, and that you feel safe with them. It's important that you feel safe with them, because the last go around when you were a child, you didn't feel safe in early childhood because your parents were wounding you every day in some way or the other. Not intentionally. It's not about blaming, because if you blame them, they had it done to them by their parents, you see, and then going on back into the multiplicity of the family system. So it's not about blaming, it's about understanding, and you certainly don't need to shame anybody about it. You just need to work on your own stuff. So this is a talk about depression and the psychology of depression, and it covers the levels of the emotional wounds, the psychological conflicts, and then the spiritual contracted energy level. They are stacked on top of each other, those levels. So you have to look into those levels to lift the depression. And when you do that, then you become less confused, and you become creative, and you become vibrant and alive. You're actually coming back to life. In the philosophies of India, they talk about it's about awakening, waking up, awakening. So when you go into this kind of material, you really wake up. It doesn't go back beyond 0. So it's your life that happened to you and your parents, and it's just nuts and bolts of why you ended up this way. But you certainly don't need to make a big deal of why. You need to unfold it, and you need to open back up. So this is the talk about depression and how to heal from it. And this is the correct path to do it. And it's not as difficult as you think, and it's worth doing it. And I would like you to consider what I've said here, and then perhaps find a good therapist and start working on this. It can change your life, and also it also might affect your next life, because if you uncontract a lot of this energy, your transition will change, and you could end up in another life. If you believe in the Eastern philosophies, then you believe in reincarnation, and it can affect your next life. So you want to do your work in this lifetime, and this is what we need to do: is clear this stuff out. And it's all intermeshed. The psychology of it, the emotions, and the spirituality is all connected. It's all interconnected. So it's all moving towards, as the Christians would say, moving towards God. But in the Eastern philosophy, it's just moving towards the light, moving towards enlightenment. So it's very important. So I have on this video, I have a link to my webpage, and I work with people over the internet and so forth. So if you would like to ask me some questions or contact me, you can contact me through my webpage, and there is a link below. So thank you for listening to this video, and I hope that you reflect on it and act on what you know. Thank you.